She was driving alone in the dark on a two-lane highway in the Argentine Pampas when her green Rover crossed the center line and struck a catering truck head-on. It was a Saturday night in September of 1998. The truck driver, a friend of hers, survived with a broken ankle. The woman at the wheel, 61 years old, not wearing a seatbelt, did not. Her name was Susan Barrantes. She was the mother of Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, the maternal grandmother of two British princesses, and 26 years earlier, in the summer of 1972, she had walked out on her English husband and her two small daughters for an Argentine polo player she had met on holiday in Corfu. A decision the British press would never quite forgive her for, and one she would never quite apologize for, until the night a green Rover and a Renault truck met head-on 80 kilometers short of the ranch she had built for herself on the other side of the world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The simplest way to describe the difficulty of writing about Susan Barrantes is to say that almost everything ever printed about her was filed under the wrong headline. The British tabloids in 1972 decided she was a scandal and stuck with the verdict for the next 26 years. The royal biographers, when they got around to her at all, decided she was a footnote and dispensed with her in a paragraph. Her own daughter, in a series of interviews stretched out over 30 years, has described her as both the woman who hit her with a hairbrush at the breakfast table and the most brilliant person she has ever met, which sounds contradictory and is not. There is a version of Susan that fits the title of this script: a vicious, ruthless mother despised by the palace, and it is not entirely wrong. There is also a version in which she was the closest non-courtier friend Charles, the Prince of Wales, had outside his own family for the last 15 years of her life. Both versions are documented. Neither is the whole picture. What is true, and what the rest of this is going to walk through in the kind of detail the tabloids never bothered with, is that Susan Barrantes was a woman who decided, at a particular point in her life, that the rules she had been raised by were not going to apply to her any longer. She paid for that decision in installments over the next quarter century in the currency in which the cost was charged, which was the gap between herself and her two small daughters. She narrowed the gap in her last decade, but she did not close it. She never closed it because she ran out of road. On a windy Saturday night in 1998, somewhere west of Buenos Aires, let me take you, as the other story did, a long way from the Argentine Pampas to a quiet village in Nottinghamshire, where a small girl in the late 1930s was being raised in the manner her mother considered appropriate to the daughter of a Wingfield. The girl from Bramcote, Susan Mary Wright, was born on the 9th of June 1937 in Bramcote, a village just west of Nottingham, into a family that occupied that particular slice of English life where genuine money and genuine title sit slightly apart from each other, both wary, both, when pressed, willing to admit that the other has its uses. Her father was Fitzherbert Wright, which is the kind of first-name English country gentlemen of his vintage were issued with on the assumption that nobody would ever have to say it twice in succession. He had been a lieutenant in the 15th/19th Hussars, which is the kind of detail that meant something at the time and is now in everyone's notes only because Susan's daughter eventually married a prince and people went looking. By the late 30s, Fitzherbert was a director of the Butterley Company, a Derbyshire concern that made coal and iron and had been run by his family for several generations. He was, on the male side, the great-grandson of Francis Wright, a Victorian industrialist and philanthropist who had built much of what the family lived on. The Wrights of this branch could be traced back to a John Wright, alias Campion, of Stowmarket in Suffolk, who had made his will in 1557, which is genuinely a long time ago, and which the family quite liked to mention. Susan's mother was the Honourable Doreen Wingfield. The Wingfields were Irish and considerably grander. They held the Powers Court Viscountcy, a title created in the 17th century and elevated in the 18th, and they sat on roughly 40,000 acres of County Wicklow, which, in the period between the granting of the title and the political weather of 20th century Ireland, had been one of the great estates of the British Isles. The seat was Powers Court House, a Palladian mansion built in the 1730s by the German architect Richard Castles, the same architect who built half the great houses of Ireland in that period, set above a valley that ran down to a 400-foot waterfall, the highest in Ireland. The house had been visited by King George IV in 1821 in a story that is told in family histories with the gleeful suggestion that the king was very nearly killed by a Wingfield engineering mishap involving a dam, the bridge below it, and the sequence in which they were respectively blown and visited. The king in the event was too drunk after lunch to make it down to the bridge and was therefore not standing on it when the dam was demolished and the bridge with it, which is the kind of detail history serves up free of charge and which the Wingfields in subsequent generations declined to dwell on. Doreen's father was Mervyn Wingfield, the 8th Viscount Powerscourt. Doreen's brother Mervyn Patrick Wingfield was the 9th. This was the side of the family Susan was raised to take seriously. The Wrights had the money. The Wingfields had the gates and the gardens and the 400-foot waterfall. She was the youngest of 4. There were 2 older sisters, Bridget and Davinia, and an older brother, Brian. By all the available accounts, the Bramcote household was correct in the way English country households of that class and that period tended to be correct. There was a nanny, there were ponies, there was a particular order to the morning, the lunch, the afternoon, the evening, and the order was not to be disturbed without serious cause. Susan was a horsey child. The Wrights kept ponies. The Wingfields kept ponies. By the time she was 10, she could ride better than most adults she met, which would later turn out to matter more than anyone could have known at the time. Her education in the British country way was an afterthought. She went to school. She did not distinguish herself. She left school as soon as it was decent to leave school. She attended a secretarial college in London for a brief period, which is what girls of that class did in the early 50s when their families had not quite decided what to do with them and wanted them to be theoretically employable in case the marriages did not happen. The marriages always happened, and the secretarial training rarely got used. What she did instead, which was the proper job of a girl in her position in the early 50s, was come out. The phrase is unfashionable now. At the time it meant that a young woman was formally presented at court to the new sovereign and entered into the London social season as a prospect. The 1954 season was Susan's. She was 17, almost 18. Queen Elizabeth II was 28, 2 years on the throne, still working out who she was as monarch and not yet bored with the mechanics of presenting débutantes, which she would in fact suspend 4 years later in 1958, after deciding that the practice was somewhere between socially obsolete and quietly absurd. So Susan made it in just under the wire. She wore a long white dress. She courtesied to the new queen. She was assessed and approved by the small group of people who did the assessing and approving in those rooms, and she went out into the dance floors and the country weekends of an English upper class that had been bombed during the war, taxed since the war, and was beginning to suspect that the next 30 years were not going to look like the previous 300. A note about her education, because it matters and is easy to misread. Susan was not stupid. The girls of her class and period were not given the kind of formal education that would make them stupid in any ordinary sense. They were taught languages. They were taught how to read a room. They were taught a shelf or two of literature and a great deal of music. And most of them, Susan included, read voraciously on their own. What they were not taught was how to do anything for money. The result was that a great many of them, Susan among them, arrived in their early 20s with a great deal of intelligence and no permission to apply it to anything more demanding than a seating plan. Some of them found a way around the constraint over time. Susan, for the next 18 years, did not. There is a small detail from this period that will become useful later. Among Susan's friends in childhood and at the back end of the school years was a girl called Frances Roche. Frances was 3 years younger. They were not best friends. 3 years is a wide gap among teenage girls, but they were the kind of girls who knew each other at parties, who got asked to the same weekends, whose mothers had between them the kind of overlapping address books that meant the daughters were going to keep meeting whether they liked it or not. Frances Roche would in 1954, the same year Susan was being presented at court, marry a man called Johnny Spencer, who was at the time the heir to the Spencer earldom. Their 4th child, born in 1961, would be christened Diana. 27 years after that, Diana and Susan's daughter Sarah would become best friends inside the royal family in a way that most outsiders never quite understood. The roots of that friendship sat in the address books of the mothers 2 generations earlier, none of which Susan, as a tall girl in a white dress in 1954, could have known. What she did know on a particular evening at a particular dance in London was that a young army lieutenant called Ronald Ferguson had walked across a room and asked her to dance. He was tall, he was good-looking, he played polo, he was on the household side of the household cavalry, stationed at Knightsbridge Barracks. He would later say, in the only memoir he ever wrote, that he did not really know what he wanted from his life, but that he was reasonably sure he wanted Susan in the middle of it. They were married 20 months later, on the 17th of January 1956, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, which is the parish church next to Westminster Abbey and which is where you got married when the abbey itself was for some reason not on offer. Susan was 18, Ronald was 24. The wedding photograph that survives shows a tall, good-looking young couple with the kind of expressions people in 1956 wore for wedding photographs, which is to say not much. She did not know at 18 what kind of marriage she had agreed to. He did not know at 24 what kind of man he was going to be. They were both about to find out. The Galloping Major. There is a piece of furniture in any account of mid-century English country life that does most of the load-bearing without ever quite being acknowledged, and it is the polo pony. To understand the marriage of Ron and Susan Ferguson and the social world they moved into in the late 50s, you have to understand that polo, which to most people is a faintly absurd sport played by men in jodhpurs at high speed, was in this particular slice of the English class system the central organizing activity. It was where you met people. It was where the royal family came to be recreational. It was where the major generals and the Argentine professionals and the daughters of viscounts ran into each other on weekend afternoons. It was, more than the Church of England and certainly more than Parliament, the institution that held the whole thing together, on grass, in summer, with a great many drinks afterwards. Ron was very good at it. Not Argentine good, but English good, which meant good enough to play with the people who mattered and not quite good enough to get paid. He played with Prince Philip, who had taken up polo seriously after the war and was by the late 50s one of the more committed amateurs in the country. He played at Smith's Lawn at Windsor, the polo ground inside the Great Park, and at Cowdray, and at Cirencester, and at all the smaller fixtures that filled out the summer calendar. He was elegant on a horse. He was a major in the household cavalry until he wasn't, and after he wasn't, he ran the Guards Polo Club, which is the polo club of the household division and effectively the senior polo club in the country. From a deputy chairmanship he held from 1971 to 1988. He was eventually the polo manager for Charles, Prince of Wales, a job he held without salary for 21 years. The press called him the Galloping Major, partly because he was a major, and partly because it sounded like the title of a 1951 Stanley Holloway film, which it was. Susan, in the early years of all this, did what she had been raised to do. They lived first in London, in a flat near Knightsbridge Barracks, then moved to a house at Ascot, which was strategically and not coincidentally close to Smith's Lawn and to Windsor Castle. She kept the house, hired and fired the staff, ordered the meals, went to the polo, said the right things to the right people in the right order, and got pregnant. Their first daughter, Jane Louisa, was born on the 26th of August 1957. Their second daughter, Sarah Margaret, was born at the London Welbeck Hospital on the 15th of October 1959. Between Jane and Sarah, there was a third pregnancy that ended in the loss of a third daughter, Sophia, after Susan developed preeclampsia, a complication of pregnancy that in 1958 was understood much less well than it is now and could kill the mother as well as the child. Susan recovered. Sophia did not. The miscarriage is mentioned in only one or two of the family accounts, in the way that things of that kind were mentioned in families of that period, which is to say briefly and not again. A picture of the marriage in this phase as best I can put it together. Ron was away most weekends through the summer playing polo. Ron was away parts of the week training at the Guards Polo Club. Ron was away parts of the year on tours and tournaments. India, Cyprus, Zambia, Finland, the various corners of the post-imperial map where polo had taken root and would for a little while longer hire English officers to come and play in their summer. By the count he himself made in his own memoir, he played in more than 16 countries over 42 years. By Susan's count, in the interview she eventually gave, he was at the house on Sunday nights in winter and not very often in summer. She raised the daughters. She ran the household. She rode in the mornings and walked the dogs in the afternoons and went to the polo on the weekends she wanted to go to, and was photographed standing next to people in the right kind of hat. This was, by the standards of the country gentry in the late 50s and early 60s, a perfectly successful marriage. Nobody was complaining. The husband was a major. The wife was a viscountcy granddaughter. The daughters were healthy. The dogs were Labradors, the horses were thoroughbreds. The royal family came to dinner sometimes in small groups, in the way the royal family came to dinner with their inner circle. There is a photograph from this period of Susan at a polo match at Smith's Lawn, standing about 3 feet away from Prince Philip, both of them laughing at something nobody in the photograph thought to write down. They were the same age, born 9 years apart but in similar climates. They moved in the same world. They were both married to other people. Andrew Loney, in his 2025 book entitled, made the claim that they were rather more than that. Loney wrote that Ron Ferguson and Susan Wright sat in the third carriage at their daughter's wedding in 1986, having been, 20 years earlier, lovers, and the implied lover, the unnamed man on the other side of the equation, was Prince Philip. The claim is unverifiable. Both of the named parties were dead by the time Loney published it, and neither had said so on the record while alive. What Ron himself wrote, in his own 1994 memoir, The Galloping Major, was the considerably softer line that he had always suspected Prince Philip had an eye for Susie, that Philip usually made a beeline for the prettiest girl on the dance floor, and that Philip certainly found Susie's company more enticing than his own. That is what a husband writes when he does not entirely trust his marriage and does not wish to make a public allegation he cannot back up. It is also what a husband writes when there is in fact nothing to back up. The reader is invited to draw the line wherever the available evidence supports. What is documented, and which sits below the question of whether anything happened with Philip, is that Ron's own conduct in the marriage was the part that eventually broke it. He had affairs. The phrasing in the obituaries and the family histories is always the polite passive. The marriage suffered from his infidelities. But the reality, when you compress it, is that Ron Ferguson, the Galloping Major, was the kind of mid-century English officer for whom marital fidelity was a stated principle that did not always survive contact with a tournament weekend. Susan, by the early 60s, was beginning to know this. She did not say anything to anybody, because women of her class and period did not say things of this kind to anybody, but she was beginning to know it. When later in the 60s she discovered that one of the affairs had been with one of her own friends, the part of her that had been keeping the marriage going on principle started to give way, very slowly, like the bottom of a riverbank. In 1968, Ron's father died, and the family moved out of the Ascot house to Dummer Down, an old Queen Anne farmhouse on a 480-acre farm at Dummer in Hampshire, which had been Ron's father's place and was now Ron's. The move was meant to be a refoundation. They were going to live in the country properly. Sarah, who had been 8 years old in the Ascot house and was now 9, would later say that the move to Dummer was the happiest part of her childhood. She had a pony, she had a paddock, she had her sister. She had the kind of unsupervised English country life that the daughters of mid-century gentry had still, just about, been allowed to have. What she did not yet know was that her mother, in the same period, had begun to understand that she had spent 12 years in a marriage to a man who could not, without serious effort, stay where he was meant to stay. And the marriage had 4 years left. The household of women. It is worth pausing here, before the holiday in Corfu and everything that came after it, on the way Susan ran the house at Dummer Down and the way her 2 daughters experienced her as a mother, because the title of this script promises a vicious and ruthless woman, and the simplest answer to that promise, the part of it that her own daughter has in adulthood said out loud, is the part about how she raised her 2 girls. Sarah Ferguson has talked about her mother on and off for the last 20 years. The talk has not been particularly flattering. In one interview with the Sunday Times, she said that if she refused to eat her semolina, her mother would hit her and tell her she needed to beat the devil out of her. In another interview with Loose Women, she described the period after her mother left as one in which she had felt worthless. In a 2015 letter to her dead mother, published in a book of such letters edited by Lisa Erspammer, Sarah wrote that not a day went by that she did not wish to pick up the phone, that she had finally come to thank and forgive her, and, in the line that holds the whole thing together, that she was convinced she would never have become a strong person without having had to deal with the feeling of abandonment. I do not think Sarah was making any of this up. The accounts are consistent across decades and across interviewers, and the kind of detail that appears in them, the semolina, the hairbrush, the small cruelties in the kitchen, is the kind of detail people remember accurately because the small cruelties are precisely what they remember. What I think the accounts do not always make clear is that Susan, in the way she raised her daughters, was not particularly unusual for an English country mother of her generation. The English upper middle and upper classes in the 1960s produced a great many mothers who hit their children with hairbrushes for refusing semolina and felt that they were doing the children a favor. The standard against which Susan looks vicious is not the standard her own mother would have applied. It is the standard her daughter applied, in adulthood after 30 years of therapy, and it is a fairer standard. It is just in the historical context an anachronistic one. What is genuinely striking about the household at Dummer is how cold it could be. The picture that emerges from the various memoirs, from Sarah's own, from Ron's, from the friends who wrote little bits afterwards, is of a mother who was not naturally affectionate, who handled physical contact with her daughters at slight remove, who believed in correctness and posture and table manners and not very much in cuddles. She was in this not Diana Spencer's mother either, who was warmer. It is worth pausing here, before the holiday in Corfu and everything that came after it, on the way Susan ran the house at Dummer Down and the way her two daughters experienced her as a mother, because the title of this script promises a vicious and ruthless woman, and the simplest answer to that promise, the part of it that her own daughter has in adulthood said out loud, is the part about how she raised her two girls. Sarah Ferguson has talked about her mother on and off for the last 20 years. The talk has not been particularly flattering. In one interview with the Sunday Times, she said that if she refused to eat her semolina, her mother would hit her and tell her she needed to beat the devil out of her. In another interview with Loose Women, she described the period after her mother left as one in which she had felt worthless. In a 2015 letter to her dead mother published in a book of such letters edited by Lisa Erspammer, Sarah wrote that not a day went by that she did not wish to pick up the phone, that she had finally come to thank and forgive her, and, in the line that holds the whole thing together, that she was convinced she would never have become a strong person without having had to deal with the feeling of abandonment. I do not think Sarah was making any of this up. The accounts are consistent across decades and across interviewers, and the kind of detail that appears in them, the semolina, the hairbrush, the small cruelties in the kitchen, is the kind of detail people remember accurately because the small cruelties are precisely what they remember. What I think the accounts do not always make clear is that Susan, in the way she raised her daughters, was not particularly unusual for an English country mother of her generation. The English upper middle and upper classes in the 1960s produced a great many mothers who hit their children with hairbrushes for refusing semolina and felt that they were doing the children. There is one further thing to say about the household before we move on, which is that the elder daughter, Jane, has spent 50 years not quite saying the things her younger sister has said in interviews. Jane, who was 2 years older than Sarah, has been the quieter of the two, has lived for most of her adult life in Australia, has been married twice, and has chosen, in the way some siblings do choose, not to feed the press the same material her sister has fed it. What Jane appears to have decided very early is that a public quarrel about a mother long dead is not something she wishes to be a part of. The result is that almost everything we know about life inside the Ferguson household at Dummer Down is filtered through Sarah's account of it. And Sarah is not and has not, in any of her own books, claimed to be a neutral observer. She is the smaller, redder-haired, less loved daughter telling the story afterwards. The story is true. It is also one story. There is a second piece of the household worth flagging, which the title of the script promises and which I do not want to leave undelivered. The phrase "hated by royals" turns out, when you examine it, to be a phrase that fits nobody in the actual narrative. No royal of any rank ever publicly said they hated Susan, and the closest anyone came was the mid-80s palace press office occasionally telling reporters that the Duchess of York's mother was on a different continent and could not be reached for comment. What the phrase does describe accurately is the thin, careful coolness with which the upper layer of the British social system regarded a woman who had married up, behaved correctly for 16 years, and then abruptly stopped behaving correctly. The royal family did not hate her. The royal family put her in the box where they put everybody whose presence was complicated and whose absence was preferred. Susan was in that box, in different drawers, for most of the 3 decades after she left England. The drawer she was in at any given moment was a function of which of her daughters was in the news that month. We will come to all of it. Corfu, 1972. The summer of 1972 is the hinge of this whole thing. By the early 70s, the Ferguson marriage had been going for 16 years and had, on the surface, all of the markers of being all right. 2 daughters, country house, Polo, Ron's career still moving in the direction of the position he would eventually hold as the Prince of Wales polo manager. Susan still photographed in the right places in the right hats. What was actually happening off camera was that Susan had had enough. She had had enough of Ron. She had had enough of the Polo wives. She had had enough of Sunday lunch and of being the woman who held everything together while her husband held nothing together at all. She had not yet decided to do anything about it. She had only decided that, if a way out presented itself, she might take a more careful look at the way out than she would have done 5 years earlier. In June or July of 1972, the family went on holiday to Corfu. Corfu in 1972 was a Greek island that had been a holiday destination of the English upper class for about 100 years, ever since the Durrells had publicized the climate. The Fergusons stayed at a villa with friends in the way that sort of holiday went. There were lunches, there were beaches, there were children running in and out. There was an Argentine polo player who had been invited along by mutual friends because polo people in 1972 socialized in a small global circuit, and Argentina was where the best polo players came from, and one of the best had recently turned up in England to play for Lord Vestey at Stowell Park. His name was Hector Eduardo Barrantes Sansoni. He was 33 years old. He was Argentine, born in 1939, descended on his father's side from a line that traced, and the Argentines, when they trace these things, trace them seriously, back through the Figueroa family to a 16th century viceroy of Peru. He had started playing polo at 15. He had moved to England at 28 to play for Vestey. He was a 10-goal handicap player, which is the highest rating in polo, achieved by fewer than 24 players in the world at any given moment. He was tall, he was very dark. He had been, before polo, a Golden Gloves heavyweight boxer and a serious rugby player. He spoke English with a heavy Argentine accent. He was, by the unanimous testimony of the people who knew him, one of the more attractive men any of them had met, and he was, in the summer of 1972, recently widowed. This last fact is the part of the story that the polite accounts have always softened, and that is, I think, central to what happened next. In February of that year, 5 months before the Corfu holiday, Hector's first wife, Luisita Hurley, had been killed in a car crash near Buenos Aires. She had been pregnant with their first child. The child died with her. Hector had been, from the accounts of the people who knew him in the spring of 1972, a man walking around in a state that was not quite shock and not quite grief, but something narrower and harder than either. He had agreed to come to Corfu because his English friends had decided it was time he came out of the house. He arrived at the villa 6 months a widower and 4 months past the death of his unborn child. Susan Ferguson, who had been thinking about the way out for 2 or 3 years, looked up across a lunch table and saw him. What happened in Corfu, between Susan and Hector, was at first the kind of thing that happens at a great many country house holidays among adults whose marriages are not working. A long conversation in a corner, a walk on a beach, the kind of careful courtesy that a man in his condition extends to a sympathetic woman. By the end of the holiday, both of them understood that something had begun. By the autumn, when Susan was back at Dummerdown and Hector was back in England playing the rest of the season for Vestey, the something had become an affair. By the end of the year, the affair had become the thing Susan was using to organize the rest of her life. I want to spend a moment on what an affair of this kind, in this period, in this social class, actually cost the people having it, because the modern reader is liable to underestimate it. In 1972, an English upper-middle-class woman of 35 did not have many of the things that would later make leaving a marriage routine. She did not generally have her own income. She did not generally have her own credit. She did not generally have her own friends, in the sense that her friends were her husband's friends and would, in the event of a divorce, side with whichever of the two had the better social standing. The legal regime around divorce in England had been liberalized in 1969, 3 years before the holiday, when the no-fault clause had been introduced, but the social regime had not caught up. A woman who left her husband in 1972 was still, in 9 of every 10 cases, the woman who had ended the marriage, regardless of who had been at fault. She would lose the friends, she would lose the country house, she would, depending on the lawyer her husband hired, lose the children. Susan was about to do all three. Ron, by every available account, knew about Corfu within a few weeks. He may not have known immediately, but he knew. What he did not know, because nobody around him quite said it in those words, was that this one was different. He had assumed on the available pattern of his own behavior that Susan's involvement with the Argentine was a retaliation, a parallel to his own affairs, the kind of thing one married woman of 43 did to upset a polo-playing husband and would in time settle. It was not that. Susan had spent her life up to that summer being the right kind of wife, by the rules she had been issued, in a house she had not chosen, married to a man she had increasingly come to dislike. She had met someone for whom none of those rules applied, who had no English country background, who had no opinions about which polo club one ought to belong to, who had recently lost everything that mattered to him, and who had no time for any of the small social cruelties she had been swimming in for 16 years. She was not retaliating, she was leaving. This last fact is the part of the story that the polite accounts have always softened, and that is, I think, central to what happened next. In February of that year, 5 months before the Corfu holiday, Hector's first wife, Luisita Hurley, had been killed in a car crash near Buenos Aires. She had been pregnant with their first child. The child died with her. Hector had been, from the accounts of the people who knew him in the spring of 1972, a man walking around in a state that was not quite shock and not quite grief, but something narrower and harder than either. He had agreed to come to Corfu because his English friends had decided it was time he came out of the house. He arrived at the villa 6 months a widower and 4 months past the death of his unborn child. Susan Ferguson, who had been thinking about the way out for 2 or 3 years, looked up across a lunch table and saw him. What happened in Corfu, between Susan and Hector, was at first the kind of thing that happens at a great many country house holidays among adults whose marriages are not working. A long conversation in a corner, a walk on a beach, the kind of careful courtesy that a man in his condition extends to a sympathetic woman. By the end of the holiday, both of them understood that something had begun. By the autumn, when Susan was back at Dummerdown and Hector was back in England playing the rest of the season for Veste, the something had become an affair. By the end of the year, the affair had become the thing Susan was using to organize the rest of her life. I want to spend a moment on what an affair of this kind, in this period, in this social class, actually cost the people having it, because the modern reader is liable to underestimate it. In 1972, an English upper-middle-class woman of 35 did not have many of the things that would later make leaving a marriage routine. She did not generally have her own income. She did not generally have her own credit. She did not generally have her own friends, in the sense that her friends were her husband's friends and would, in the event of a divorce, side with whichever of the two had the better social standing. The legal regime around divorce in England had been liberalized in 1969, 3 years before the holiday, when the no-fault clause had been introduced, but the social regime had not caught up. A woman who left her husband in 1972 was still, in 9 of every 10 cases, the woman who had ended the marriage, regardless of who had been at fault. She would lose the friends, she would lose the country house, she would, depending on the lawyer her husband hired, lose the children. Susan was about to do all three. Ron, by every available account, knew about Corfu within a few weeks. He may not have known immediately, but he knew. What he did not know, because nobody around him quite said it in those words, was that this one was different. He had assumed on the available pattern of his own behavior that Susan's involvement with the Argentine was a retaliation, a parallel to his own affairs, the kind of thing one married woman of 43 did to upset a polo-playing husband and would in time settle. It was not that. Susan had spent her life up to that summer being the right kind of wife, by the rules she had been issued, in a house she had not chosen, married to a man she had increasingly come to dislike. She had met someone for whom none of those rules applied, who had no English country background, who had no opinions about which polo club one ought to belong to, who had recently lost everything that mattered to him, and who had no time for any of the small social cruelties she had been swimming in for 16 years. She was not retaliating, she was leaving. She did not tell Ron immediately. She did not tell anybody immediately, except perhaps her sister Bridget. She waited through the autumn of 1972. She waited through the Christmas of 1972, which she spent at Dummer with the daughters and Ron, knowing what she was about to do and not yet doing it. She waited through the spring of 1973. By the early summer of 1973, the affair had been running for nearly a year. The daughters had begun to notice that their mother was different, and the household had reached the kind of low temperature that an English country household can sustain for years if it has to, but cannot, in the end, sustain forever. Susan packed a suitcase. She told Ron she was going. She told the daughters, in a conversation that has not survived in any reliable form, that she was leaving for Argentina to be with a man they had met once or twice, and that they would be staying with their father at Dummer Down. Sarah was 13 years old, Jane was 15. The exact words of that conversation are not on any record I have been able to find. What is on the record is the result, which was that Susan got into a car, and then onto a plane, and then onto another plane, and arrived in Buenos Aires later that year with the entire English chapter of her life in 2 cases and a cabin bag. The divorce was finalized in May of 1974. Susan and Hector married at the Register Office in Chichester in July of 1975, in a ceremony attended by almost no one, a few of Susan's relatives on the Wingfield side, a couple of mutual Polo friends, a registrar, and a witness. They flew straight back to Argentina afterwards. The British press, which had been told as little as it was possible to tell them and which therefore had filled in the gaps with imagination, settled on the description that would follow Susan for the rest of her life. She was the bolter, after Nancy Mitford's character in The Pursuit of Love, the woman who runs from her marriage and her children for the love of an unsuitable man. Mitford had used the term affectionately. The British press, 25 years on, used it less so. The bolter. There was, in the social world Susan had walked out of, an unwritten code about this kind of departure, and the code was very precise about which kinds of leaving were forgivable and which kinds were not. A wife could leave a husband for his cruelty, his drinking, his violence, or his bankruptcy. A wife could leave a husband for another man, if the another man was English and reasonably grand and the wife was prepared to spend the next 10 years apologizing in the right drawing rooms. What a wife could not do, under the code, was leave a husband and 2 small daughters for a foreign professional polo player whose country was about to have a military coup, was about to invade the Falklands a decade later, and whose only English was the kind he had picked up in stables. Susan did the third thing. The English upper class in the summer of 1972 had no template for what she had done, and so it did the thing it always did when it had no template. It closed. The daughters were not allowed to come to Argentina. This was the part that has been most softened in the various accounts and that I want to be clear about, because it shapes everything that comes after. There was no question of Jane and Sarah going to live with their mother. The reasons given at the time by Ron and his lawyers and the family more broadly included the schools, the climate, the political situation, the unfamiliarity of the stepfather, and the general principle that children of that class did not get taken to the Pampas. The reason that was not given in those terms but which sits behind all the others is that nobody wanted them to go. Ron wanted them at Dummer. The grandparents wanted them at Dummer. The English social order such as it remained in 1973 wanted them at Dummer. Susan, when she chose for herself. The daughters stayed. Sarah, who was 13, took it as abandonment. She would later describe in interviews and in her own books the experience of a mother getting on a plane and not coming back. She would describe the gap that opened in her between the age of 13 and the age of about 35, in which she was, by her own description, looking for a mother in a great many wrong places. She would describe what she ate during this period, which was a great deal more than she should have been eating. The eating disorder she developed at 12 when the marriage was visibly breaking down, ran into adulthood, and would later become one of the things the British tabloid press used to humiliate her. The Duchess of York nickname, the weight columns, the grim arithmetic of pounds gained between public appearances. Sarah herself has been candid about the source. She was a child whose mother had walked out and whose father, by his own admission, did not know quite how to close the gap. She ate to fill it. The eating did not fill it. Nothing did. Ron remarried in 1976. His second wife was also called Susan Deptford, a quieter woman who had no interest in being a public figure and who, by a small mercy of timing, became the steady stepmother in the daughters' lives at the precise moment they most needed one. She had 3 more children with Ron, Andrew, Alice, and Eliza, and the household at Dummer became in the second half of the 70s one of those second marriage country houses with 2 sets of daughters and a baby and a great many ponies, in which everybody was managing as best they could. The second Susan was, on the evidence of those who knew her, an entirely good person, and she does not appear in this story very often only because her decency is not the kind of thing that generates anecdote. Sarah, in her own later interviews, has been unfailingly affectionate about her stepmother, in a way that she has not always been about her mother. The contrast tells you something about both relationships. The first Susan in Argentina did not write very often. She wrote sometimes. She telephoned at intervals. She came to England once or twice a year for the polo season because Hector played in England every summer and the trip had a professional reason as well as a sentimental one. The visits were tense. Sarah, in the books and interviews she wrote later, has described these visits as attempts that did not quite work. The mother who came back for 2 weeks in July was not the mother who had left in 1973. She was tanner, she was thinner, she spoke a little Spanish, she talked a great deal about horses. She did not, on the testimony of either daughter, sit either of them on her knee and say sorry. She had decided by then that going to Argentina was the right thing to have done, and saying sorry would have been the beginning of a sentence that ended in unsaying it. So she did not start the sentence. She told the daughters about the ranch. She told them about the foals. She kissed them on the cheek and got back on the plane. This is the part of Susan that the title of this script most fairly describes. There is a coldness in the way a woman walks out of a household with 2 daughters in it and does not for the rest of her life treat the leaving as the central thing she did. Sarah felt it. Jane felt it less openly but felt it. The English friends who had known Susan before 1972 felt it on the daughter's behalf and stopped writing to her. The royal family, which had received Susan and Ron at small gatherings through the 60s and which had counted them as the sort of people one had at things, did not formally cut her, because the royal family does not formally cut anybody, but it did the slow English version of cutting, which is to stop putting the name on the list. Susan was not on the lists for the rest of the 70s. Then a 4th daughter by another marriage married the Queen's 2nd son, and the lists were redrawn. There is one more thing to be said before we leave the 70s, which is about Ron. Ron, in the years after Susan left, did the thing that the abandoned husbands of his class and period did, which was carry on. He kept the polo, he kept the Guards Polo Club deputy chairmanship, he took on the Prince of Wales polo manager job, unpaid, in 1976 and held it for 12 years. He raised the daughters with the 2nd Susan. He was, by all the available accounts, not vindictive about the 1st Susan, did not run her down to the daughters, did not block her visits, did not, the easy thing, the cheap thing, punish her through the children. He was in this more decent than he gets credit for. He had his own catastrophes coming, in the form of the Wigmore Club in 1988, but in the years between 1972 and 1988, the available record shows a man trying to do the dad job he had not been particularly good at while the wife was there and was now, in her absence, doing better than he had any right to expect. El Pucará, Argentina, in the summer of 1973 when Susan first arrived, was a country going through one of its periodic political crises. Juan Perón had returned from 18 years of Spanish exile in June. He was elected president in October. He died in July of 1974. His 3rd wife Isabel succeeded him. The military took over in March of 1976. The Dirty War began. Tens of thousands of people disappeared over the next 7 years, most of them in Buenos Aires, most of them young, most of them never accounted for. The Falklands War was fought in 1982. The military government collapsed in 1983. Susan, throughout all of this, lived on a polo ranch. The ranch was called El Pucará. Pucará is a Quechua word meaning a fortress or a stronghold, and the choice of name was not accidental. Hector's family had come originally from the northwest of Argentina, which is the part of the country where Quechua is still spoken in the hills, and the name was a small homage to that side of his ancestry. The ranch sat about 350 miles southwest of Buenos Aires, in the province of Buenos Aires itself, near the small town of Trenquelauquen. The land around it was Pampas, flat, treeless, enormous, the kind of grassland that goes on far enough that the curvature of the earth becomes a thing one is conscious of. The estate was about 1,000 acres at its largest, smaller after Hector's death and Susan's sale to Carrie Packer in the early 90s. It produced cattle and polo ponies. The polo ponies were the point. Hector and Susan between them ran a breeding program. They raised something like 500 foals per year, of which a portion would be sold on to international polo markets, the United States, Europe, the Asian circuits, and the rest would be trained and either kept or moved through the more local Argentine system. The work was constant. There is a particular thing about a polo pony breeding operation, which is that the horses do not stop because you stopped. They have to be fed in the morning, exercised, watched for lameness, weighed, separated, mated, foaled, weaned, broken, schooled. 1,000 acres in the Pampas is not a hobby, it is a business. Susan, who had spent her first 36 years of life being decorative in English drawing rooms, found herself at 37 in charge of the parts of a working ranch that her husband, who was on tour for half the year, could not be in charge of himself. She was by all accounts very good at it. She had all those years in England been a horse person who was not allowed to do anything serious with horses. In Argentina, she did the serious things with horses. She knew the bloodlines. She knew the names of the foals and the mothers. She managed the staff, a small group of peones and capataces. In Spanish, she taught herself by the kind of immersion that an English country woman in her late 30s acquires when there is no alternative. She rode every morning. She kept dogs. She wore the kind of clothes one wears on a working ranch. Moleskins, cotton shirts, the practical boots that nobody who has not lived on a ranch quite understands the importance of. She was, in her own later description, in a 1992 interview with Hello magazine, happier in this period than she had ever been before in her life. The interviews, when they came in the late 80s and the early 90s, all said this. Susan in Argentina had become, by every evidence available to outside observers, a different person. The sharp brittleness that had been visible in the photographs of the late 60s, the nervous half-smile in the Polo Club shots from Smith's Lawn, was gone. She was tan, she was relaxed, she wore her hair shorter. She laughed in the way people laugh when they have decided that the room they are in is a room they want to be in. She had in her own framing 2 or 3 things that mattered to her. Hector, the horses, the idea of doing some kind of work of her own. The third of these was the part that was new, and it was the part she would build on after Hector died. The work she found for herself in the 70s and into the 80s was documentary filmmaking. Argentine television in this period was a small industry with a particular interest in the country's 2 great visual exports, its football and its horses, and Susan, who knew the horses better than almost any of the people working in the industry, started picking up small assignments to consult on, and then to write, and then to produce, short documentary films about polo and about horse breeding and about the gauchos. She was not a trained filmmaker, she had no formal credentials. What she had was the same thing she had had at every other stage of her life, which was a small viscounty somewhere in her ancestry, a great deal of confidence, and the ability to charm rooms full of men into giving her things they had not been planning to give her. The rooms were now in Buenos Aires and the language was Spanish, but the technique was the same. The phrase she kept using in the later interviews when she described this period was the happiest time of my life, which is the phrase people use about the period of their lives in which they had been most allowed to do the work they actually wanted to do. Susan had wanted to work. She had not been allowed to work at any point during the 18 years of her first marriage. She was, in her late 30s and 40s, allowed to. Argentina permitted her things England had not. The political weather in Argentina in this decade was, for any English-speaking observer, alarming. The military junta of 1976 to 1983 ran what is now generally described as state terror, in which suspected political opponents were arrested without due process, held in secret detention centers, tortured, and in many cases murdered. The number of disappeared is generally given as around 30,000, though the precise figure has never been fixed. Susan on the ranch was a long way from the centers of all this. Trenclahuican is not Buenos Aires. The Pampas was, throughout the dirty war, mostly insulated from the worst of it, but the political weather was visible at the edges. Foreigners on Argentine ranches in the late 70s kept their politics carefully to themselves. Susan, who had no particular politics anyway and whose interest in Argentina was exclusively horse-related, had no trouble with this. Hector, who was Argentine, had the more delicate task of being a public figure in a country where being a public figure was a small risk, and managed it by being a public figure exclusively about polo, on which the junta had no opinion. He enlisted briefly in the Argentine army during the Falklands War in 1982, in the way patriotic Argentine men of his generation did, and did not see combat. The war was over in 74 days. He came home, picked up where he had left off, played the rest of the season, and never spoke about it. The Falklands War is worth one further line, because it is the moment in which Susan's 2 lives, the English one and the Argentine one, collided in public. Sarah, 22 years old and working at a London publishing house at the time, was a British subject by birth in a country at war with the country in which her mother lived and to whose national army her mother's husband had briefly returned. The British tabloids, who already disliked Susan, had a small festival of speculation about whose side the Ferguson women were on. The answer, from every member of the Ferguson family who was asked, was that they were on Britain's side and would prefer not to be asked again. Susan in Argentina said nothing in public for the duration of the war. She wrote to her daughters more than usual. She kept her head down. The war ended in June of 1982. Both governments declared victory and Argentina's junta fell within the year. There was, throughout this whole decade, the constant low-grade absence of the daughters, who were on another continent, in another time zone, growing up in a different country in a way Susan could not be present for. Sarah and Jane, by the late 70s, were teenagers becoming young women. Sarah went to Hurst Lodge, a private school in Berkshire. She left at 16, in the way the daughters of country gentry left school at 16, with no particular qualification and no particular plan. She went to a secretarial college in London, in the same way her mother had gone to a secretarial college in London 25 years before, and worked for a London publishing firm, and lived in a flat in Clapham, and became in the early 80s a generally cheerful young woman of the kind London was full of in 1983. There was nothing in her life at this point that suggested it was about to change. There was nothing in particular in the air that suggested her mother's life was about to change with it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Then, in 1985, Sarah was invited to a house party at Flores Castle, the seat of the Duke of Roxburgh in the Scottish borders. Diana, Princess of Wales, Francis Roche's daughter, all those years later, had already met her once or twice and quite liked her. So, more importantly, did Diana's brother-in-law Andrew, the Queen's second son, who was 25, a serving naval officer, generally considered the most eligible single man of his generation, and who, after a quiet weekend in Scotland and a more intentional weekend at Windsor during Royal Ascot, decided that he would like to marry her. He proposed on the 19th of February 1986, his 26th birthday, with a Burmese ruby surrounded by 10 diamonds in a setting he had himself sketched. Sarah said yes. The engagement was announced on the 17th of March. The wedding was scheduled for the 23rd of July at Westminster Abbey. Susan in Argentina took the call from her daughter and understood, before Sarah was halfway through saying it, that she was about to be put back in a great many photographs. The carriage on the wedding day. The wedding of Andrew and Sarah on the 23rd of July 1986 was the biggest English social event of the year and one of the biggest royal weddings of the post-war period. The figure most often quoted for the global television audience is around 500 million viewers, which is the kind of number people quote and nobody ever quite verifies. Westminster Abbey was full, the mall was lined. The bridesmaids included Andrew's young cousin Zara Phillips and the slightly older Lady Rosanna Innes Kerr, daughter of the Duke of Roxburgh, at whose house Sarah had met Andrew the year before. The bride wore an ivory silk dress with a 17-foot train. The groom wore the dark blue ceremonial uniform of a Royal Navy lieutenant. The Queen, as she always did at events of this kind, looked as if she were thinking about something else and was nevertheless paying perfect attention. The Queen Mother was photographed laughing at something Princess Margaret had said. Margaret had been, in her own youth, the Cushing-style figure of the British royal world, the daughter who married badly and chose unsuitable men, and whose own divorce was nearly the only thing in living royal memory that had matched the scandal index of Susan Ferguson's bolt to Argentina. Margaret, on the testimony of those who knew her, was rather fond of Susan. They had recognized something in each other at small dinners in the 60s, whether it was the imperfectly fitting marriage or the visible relief at being out of one, neither would ever quite say. Susan was there. She had flown in from Argentina with Hector several days before. She had stayed in London. She had been fitted for a dress at Hartnell. She had attended the rehearsals and the receptions. On the morning of the wedding, she rode in the third carriage in the procession back to Buckingham Palace, with Hector beside her and Major Ron and his second wife in the same carriage, which is the kind of seating arrangement that would be a logistical impossibility in most divorced families and which the British royal family pulled off the way it pulls everything off, which is to say with a great deal of careful pre-planning and a small amount of pretending. The photographs of Susan from this day are striking. She was 49. She was tan from the southern hemisphere winter. She wore a dress and a hat in a careful pale color, and she stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony alongside the Queen, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, Prince Charles, Diana, Major Ron, Mrs. Susan Ferguson II, and Hector Barrantes, the Argentine polo player whom most of the people in the photograph had never met before that week and would never see again. She did not, in the photographs, look out of place. She had been raised by a mother who was a Wingfield and presented at court in 1954 and married for 18 years to a man who had ridden polo with the Duke of Edinburgh. And on the question of whether she could stand on a Buckingham Palace balcony with the royal family without making it look like she shouldn't have been there, the answer that Susan herself had always known and that was now visible to 500 million strangers was that she could. Her relationship to the family at this point was the kind of thing that does not have a clean English name. She was the bride's mother. She was a first cousin once removed of a viscount. She was a long-standing friend of Prince Charles who had liked her in the late 60s before any of this happened, and who would in 1997 contribute a foreword to a book she was about to write. She was, depending on which source you trusted, and again the rumor is unverifiable, a former lover of Prince Philip, or possibly only a woman Prince Philip had liked dancing with, or possibly only a woman Ron Ferguson suspected Prince Philip of having liked dancing with. She was the woman who had bolted in 1972 and gone to Argentina, which was the kind of thing the royal family had a long memory about and a short tongue about, both of which suited Susan because she had no interest in being talked about and a quiet talent for being remembered. There is a photograph of her with Sarah in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, taken about an hour before the procession went out. Susan is straightening Sarah's veil. Sarah is laughing about something. Susan is not laughing. She has the absolutely unblinking concentration of a woman setting straight a piece of fabric on a daughter she is not going to see for a long time afterwards. Sarah's red hair is up. The veil is the kind of weight a Hartnell veil weighed in 1986. The mother's hands are visible, the daughter's hands are not. This is the photograph that in any honest life of Susan Barrantes ought to be on the cover, because everything in her relationship with her younger daughter is in it. She had not been there for almost any of the daughter's life. She was here for the wedding, and she was straightening the veil. The detail that matters about the wedding day, for the rest of this story, is what happened after it. Sarah, at 26, became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. She became, by reflex of the British tabloid press, a public figure on a scale that nobody in the Ferguson family had ever been before. Major Ron, who had been a polo manager for years, was now the Duchess of York's father, and the press attached itself to him with a steady appetite that would 2 years later find the Wigmore Club and end his career. Susan, who had spent the previous 14 years on a ranch in the Pampas, was now the Duchess of York's mother, and the press attached itself to her with an appetite that was at first less acute because she lived 4,000 miles away, and then more so, as the marriage of her daughter began to come apart and the press realized that the Duchess's mother might in time say things her daughter could not. Susan gave her first reluctant interview to Hello magazine in June of 1988, 2 years after the wedding, in the way English women of her class gave interviews to Hello in 1988, which was reluctantly and with caveats and with full editorial control over the photographs. She gave a fuller interview in 1992. She gave several more after that. She was, by the early 90s, the rare member of the wider Ferguson and royal connection who was prepared to go on the record about anything, and the press, which had got nothing useful out of any of the others, paid attention. What she said, when she said anything, was generally measured. She defended her daughter. She defended Hector when he was alive and his memory after he died. She did not, on most of the available records, say anything actively damaging about Andrew or about the Queen or about any of the more sensitive figures in the picture. She did, however, in one Italian magazine interview given at the time of Sarah's separation in 1992, and excerpted decades later in Andrew Loney's entitled, say something that the rest of her family would have preferred she did not, which was that her daughter, if her custody arrangements were not respected, was prepared to tell some stories about the royal family that would not be very pleasant. The line was a bargaining tactic, half bluff and half warning, delivered in the kind of magazine the British royal household did not read but the British royal household's lawyers did. It was the closest Susan came in any of her interviews to weaponizing what she knew. She did not do it again. The Wigmore Club and the Texan, two parallel disasters, arrived in 1988 and 1992. The first was Major Ron, in the summer and autumn of 1988, News of the World, which, in the British press of that period, did the work that nobody else was prepared to do and frequently did it badly, produced a story about Ron's membership of an establishment called the Wigmore Club near Wigmore Street in central London. The Wigmore Club, as the News of the World described it, was a health club and massage parlor staffed by women in starched white medical-style uniforms who, in addition to massages, allegedly offered an a la carte menu of what would now be called sex work. Ron's defense when the story broke was that he had used the establishment for legitimate massage only, by which he meant a totally straight one, and that he had treated the place as a kind of cocoon in which he could shut himself away for an hour and think. The phrase kind of cocoon did him no favors. Newspapers wrote about the Wigmore Club for several weeks. Ron was forced to resign as Prince Charles' polo manager. He stepped down from his position at the Guards Polo Club. He kept his marriage to the second Mrs. Ferguson, who appears to have been more forgiving than the press, and he was eventually reinstated at the Guards Polo Club shortly before his death in 2003. He spent the rest of his life vaguely embarrassed about it and openly defensive. The second and worst disaster was Sarah herself. Her marriage to Andrew, which had looked at the wedding like the kind of marriage that lasts, had begun to fracture by 1990. Andrew was a serving naval officer for most of the period. By Sarah's own count, given to the biographer Sarah Bradford, the couple saw each other for only 40 days a year during the first 5 years of their marriage. The press, which had by 1989 turned on Sarah and begun calling her the Duchess of York because of her weight, had run out of patience with her by 1991. In January of 1992, the Daily Mail published a set of photographs that had been taken from a left-behind portfolio in a London flat. The photographs showed Sarah in close company with Steve Wyatt, a Texan businessman, son of the Houston Society figure Lynn Wyatt. One of the photographs showed Wyatt holding Sarah's infant daughter Beatrice. The photographs had been left at the flat by accident. They were published deliberately. The marriage, which had been going on momentum for 2 years, did not survive them. Sarah and Andrew announced their separation on the 19th of March 1992. They divorced in 1996. Then, in the summer of 1992, the second tabloid catastrophe arrived. A photographer with a long lens, working from a hill above a villa in the south of France, photographed Sarah at a private holiday with the American financial advisor John Bryan. The photographs, which were published in the Daily Mirror in August, showed Bryan kissing the toes of the Duchess of York, while Sarah, topless, lay beside the swimming pool. The young princesses Beatrice and Eugenie were visible in some of the frames. The photographs, which had been taken without the subject's knowledge, ran for days across the front pages of every British tabloid. The toe-sucking became, in British public life, the kind of single defining image that follows a person for the rest of their career, in the way a single misjudged sentence had followed Major Ron about the cocoon. Sarah was at Balmoral with the royal family when the photographs broke. The Queen, by the testimony of those present, did not raise her voice about it, and did not need to. The Duchess of York was given to understand that the period in which she was a working royal was over. Sarah went home to her own house. She did not go back to Balmoral as a member of the family. Susan, who was on the ranch when the Wigmore Club story broke, and on the ranch when the Steve Wyatt photographs ran, and on the ranch when the toe-sucking happened, watched all of this from 4,000 miles away, with the helpless attention of a mother who can do nothing useful from that distance. She did one thing, which I have already mentioned, and I want to come back to it briefly because it tells you something about her. She gave the Gente interview in Italy, in which she signaled that her daughter would not go quietly if the royal household tried to shut her out of her children. The interview did not produce the consequence she was threatening. Sarah did, in the event, retain joint custody of Beatrice and Eugenie, and the threat to publish royal stories was never realized, because Sarah, whatever else can be said of her, has never in fact done that. But the interview is interesting because it is the only moment in the public record at which Susan, who had spent her life refusing to be the kind of person who fed information to the press, picked up a card and laid it face up on the table. She did it for her daughter. She did it because, having been the mother who walked out in 1972, she was not going to be the mother who stood by silently in 1992. The decision was clean. It was also unmistakably the decision of a woman who had decided, 20 years earlier, that she was not going to play by the rules her own mother would have applied, and who had not changed her mind in the intervening time. There is a thing worth noting about this period from the royal family's perspective, because the title of this script promises a woman hated by royals, and the years from 1988 to 1992 are the years in which something close to that came briefly true. It was not the Queen who had the problem. The Queen, whose tolerance for in-laws of every shape was famous within the household, kept Susan at the same precise, polite distance she had kept her at since the wedding, and would maintain it until Susan died. The problem was the household, the courtiers, the press secretaries, the people whose job it was to manage the institutional response to the cascading catastrophes of 1988 to 1992. Those people, as a class, did not enjoy Susan's existence. Susan was the kind of figure they could not control and did not understand. She lived on a different continent. She did not depend on royal goodwill for any of her income. She was the mother of an increasingly difficult duchess and the grandmother of 2 princesses of the blood. She was, in short, a problem the household had no useful tool for solving. They were not warm to her. They were not invited to be. The coolness was institutional rather than personal, and Susan, who had spent her adult life being cool to people for institutional reasons, did not particularly mind it. What was personal throughout this period was Charles. Charles continued to be warm to Susan, in private, regardless of the institutional weather. He sent letters, he took her calls when she rang, he visited her, briefly and quietly, when he was in Argentina on tours that included Buenos Aires. He was a man who, throughout his life, has tended to keep the friends he has from before the institution closed in around him, and Susan was one of those friends. The friendship was not in any sense romantic. The friendship was the friendship of a man who had known a woman since she was the wife of his polo manager, and who had decided at some point in the early 70s that the polite thing about her bolt to Argentina was not to discuss it. The arrangement suited both of them. A death in August. In the summer of 1989, Hector Barrantes was diagnosed with cancer of the lymph glands. He was 50 years old. He was, by every measure available, in the middle of his life, and by every measure available, his life was now going to be considerably shorter than it should have been. The diagnosis was kept private for as long as Hector could keep it private, which was several months. He continued to play polo into the spring of 1990. He traveled to England for the start of the summer season. He played very thinly in the early matches. He was photographed at a tournament looking 40 pounds lighter than he had been the previous summer. And the people who had not known were now told, and the people who had known the whole time stopped pretending they didn't. He died at home at El Pucará on the 10th of August 1990. He was 51, Susan was 53. They had been together for 18 years, they had been married for 15. He was buried initially at the Jardín de la Paz cemetery in Buenos Aires. Susan eventually had him moved, several years later, to a vault that was constructed beneath the main house at El Pucará, next to the polo field he had ridden on for most of his adult life. The vault was designed to hold 2 coffins. The second one would not be filled for another 8 years. There is a thing about widowhood that the people who have not yet been widowed do not always understand, which is that the practical problems arrive immediately and the grief arrives in waves, sometimes years apart. The practical problems for Susan arrived within weeks. She was running a 1,000-acre breeding operation in the early 90s Argentine economy on the basis of an income stream that had been substantially generated by her husband's name. The polo world had been buying foals from Hector Barrantes. It was not in the same numbers willing to buy foals from his widow. The accounts, which had been thin even when he was alive, were unsustainable within 2 years. In 1992 or 1993, the dates in the various accounts are not consistent and I have not been able to pin them down precisely. Susan sold a substantial portion of the ranch to Kerry Packer. Packer was an Australian media mogul, the owner of the Nine Network, a billionaire by every available count, and a serious polo enthusiast. He had been buying ponies from El Pucará for years. He was, in this transaction, the kind of buyer one wants when one is a recently widowed Englishwoman in the Argentine Pampas who needs to convert land into liquidity quickly and discreetly. The sum has never been disclosed. Susan kept a smaller piece of the property, including the house and the vault and the polo field, and Packer took the rest. She moved, with the proceeds of the sale, into a flat in the Recoleta Palermo area of Buenos Aires, which is the part of the city where the Argentine upper class has lived for most of the 20th century. The flat was substantial. It was filled with the things she had accumulated over 20 years on the ranch: the books, the paintings, the photographs, the cluster of small framed pictures of the granddaughters in England that the staff had been instructed to dust carefully and leave where they were. She set up a small television production company. She made documentary films about horses. She wrote, over several years, a coffee table book called Polo, which was published in 1997 by Art Books International, which had a foreword by the Prince of Wales and an introduction by Juan Carlos Harriot, the legendary Argentine polo player, and which is, on the available evidence of the surviving copies, the kind of book that exists primarily to be looked at, and which is full of very good photographs of horses in motion. Charles' foreword was the kind of thing Charles wrote, which is to say warm, slightly rambling, and visibly affectionate. He liked her. He had liked her for 30 years. He continued to like her after she had divorced his polo manager, after she had moved to Argentina, after his sister-in-law's marriage to her daughter had collapsed, and through the periodic interviews Susan had given that the rest of his family were less keen on. The foreword for Polo in 1997 was not a careful piece of royal diplomacy. It was the foreword a friend writes for a friend. The period between Hector's death in 1990 and her own in 1998 was, in Susan's own description, a quieter 8 years. She was no longer at the center of an operating ranch. She had a flat in the city. She drove out to the country at weekends to keep an eye on the smaller piece of El Pucará she had retained and to see the horses. She gave the Hello interviews in 1988 and 1992 and afterwards. She came to England every July for the polo season at Smith's Lawn, where she had been photographed for the first time as a young wife in 1957, and where she was now photographed as the Duchess of York's mother. She saw her grandchildren, Princess Beatrice, born in 1988, and Princess Eugenie, born in 1990, when she could. There is a photograph of her with both girls at a picnic in the early 90s that survives in the Getty archive, and the Susan in it is older and tireder than the Susan on the Buckingham Palace balcony, but the smile is recognizably the same. She had survived the worst thing that had happened to her, which was Hector's death. She had not in any visible way recovered from it. The remarkable thing about widows of the kind Susan now was, is that they very often function for years afterwards in a way that looks from outside like ordinary life, and that is, on the inside, something narrower and tighter and more provisional than that. There is one more piece of this period that is worth mentioning because it is in the photographs and the gossip columns of the early 90s, and because it suggests something about the texture of Susan's last decade. She did not date anyone after Hector. There were no further men. This was not a public position she took, in the way that very famous widows sometimes take public positions about not remarrying. It was simply what happened. She was a 53-year-old widow when Hector died, and the available men in the Polo and Anglo-Argentine social circles she moved in were not in short supply, and several of them made approaches over the next few years, and she turned every one of them down. She had married twice. The first marriage had been a mistake by the standards she eventually applied to it. The second marriage had been the love of her life. She did not propose to add a third number to the sequence and dilute either of the previous ones. She lived alone in the flat in Recoleta. She kept dogs, she read, she wrote. She came to England in July. She was, in her last decade, a single woman of independent habits whose work was mostly her own, and whose social life was largely with old friends from the ranch period and with a small Argentine circle of women her age. It was not a glamorous life. It was hers. The interviews. I want to come back before the end of this to the interviews Susan gave in the last decade of her life, because they are the only sustained piece of testimony from her own mouth that we have, and most accounts skip past them. The interviews started in 1988, 2 years after Sarah's wedding, in Hello magazine. They continued through the 90s, Hello, again in 1992, then a series of smaller pieces, then occasional sit-downs with the more serious British and Argentine press, then the Gente interview in Italy at the time of Sarah's separation. The body of material runs to perhaps 20,000 words across all of them. It is not a full self-portrait, it is the careful, controlled emergence of a woman who had spent 15 years on a ranch refusing to talk to anyone and who had, after her son-in-law's wedding, decided that some kind of public position was now required of her. What Susan said when she said anything was largely consistent across the interviews. She had not regretted leaving England, she had not regretted leaving Ron. She regretted, in a phrasing she used several times, the way the leaving had affected her daughters, but she did not regret the leaving itself. She loved Argentina, she loved Hector, she had been happier there than she had been anywhere else. She thought polo was the most beautiful sport in the world, and she thought the Argentine Pampas was the most beautiful landscape, and she thought her daughter Sarah was a remarkable young woman who had been treated badly by the British press. She was generous about Charles. She was respectful about the Queen. She was careful about Philip. She was on the subject of Andrew, less careful than perhaps she should have been. In one of the later interviews, she made the now-quoted observation that if Andrew had any character, perhaps his marriage would not have broken up, which is the kind of remark a former mother-in-law makes when she has in fact already used up most of her tact on the rest of the subject. The thing the interviews collectively suggest, when you read them in sequence, is that Susan in the 90s had reached a position of which she was reasonably proud. She had been written out of one social order in 1972 and had built another order in Argentina. She had been written back into the original order, on a kind of provisional visa, in 1986 when her daughter married a prince. She was now the mother of a duchess and the grandmother of 2 princesses, and she had achieved this from a 1,000-acre ranch in the Pampas without modifying any of the choices she had made between the ages of 35 and 40. She had been right in her own framing to leave. Argentina had vindicated her. The fact that Sarah's marriage was unraveling did not retrospectively make her own marriage to Ron worth saving, and she said so. The note that ran through almost all of the interviews, slightly underneath the surface, was about the daughters. Susan, by the early 90s, had begun to understand what the leaving had cost the daughters in a way she had not understood, or had not let herself understand, in the 70s. She did not say so directly. The phrasing in the interviews is tactful. I think children sometimes feel things very deeply that one does not realize at the time, that kind of construction. But it is in the sentence structure, in the things she circles around without quite landing on. She had begun to see Sarah as someone she had damaged. She had begun to see, perhaps for the first time, that her own choices in 1972 had not been free of cost. They had been free of cost to her because Argentina had absorbed them, and they had cost the 2 girls in Hampshire who had had no say in any of it. She did not apologize in any of the surviving material, in clean enough terms for anyone to call it an apology. What she did in the late interviews and in the small private moments her daughter has described in the later books was call Sarah more often. She wrote more letters. She came to London more frequently. She held Beatrice and Eugenie when she was able to. She was not, in any conventional sense, making it up. She was edging toward the version of being a mother that she had not been able to be at 25 years too late, with a daughter who had spent that 25 years figuring out how to live without her. This is the thing the title of this script most fails to capture. The vicious and ruthless framing is the framing the British tabloid press applied in 1972, after which it stuck, the way nicknames of that kind do stick. The reality in the last decade of her life was a woman who had begun to soften, who had begun to make the long-distance calls she had not made in 1975, and who would have, given another 10 years, almost certainly arrived at a place with her daughters where the leaving had been forgiven. She did not get the 10 years, she got 8. There is one more detail from the interviews that is worth quoting, because it is the only line of Susan's that I have found in all the surviving material, in which she allows herself to say something close to the thing the daughters had needed her to say. She said, in one of the sit-downs in the early 90s, that the only true regret of her life was that she had not been able to take her daughters with her when she went. That is not an apology for going, it is an apology for the bit of going that hurt. There is a difference, but it is the closest she ever got, and it is the closest, given who she was ever going to get. The flipped car. In 1997, Susan was driving on a road in Argentina when her car flipped. The number of flips reported in the various accounts is 7. 7 full revolutions of a saloon car on a Pampas highway is the kind of thing nobody is supposed to walk away from, and Susan walked away from it. She was bruised, she was shaken, she was hospitalized briefly and discharged. She did not, by the testimony of her family, change anything about her driving afterwards. This is the detail that makes the September 1998 crash painful in a particular way, because it was telegraphed. Susan had been driving fast on Argentine country roads for 25 years. Argentine country roads in the 90s were 2-lane highways with no shoulder, no central barrier, no street lights, no rumble strips, and a great deal of agricultural traffic. The combination of an experienced driver, a fast car, and a road that does not forgive the slightest distraction is the combination that fills the pages of the police statistics in any country that has rural highways and rich people on them. Susan, in 1997, had been given a warning that almost nobody in her position is ever given, which is the chance to walk away from one accident before having a worse one. She did not change. What she also did not change was that she did not wear a seatbelt. The Argentine seatbelt laws of the period were not as thoroughly enforced as the equivalent British or American laws. The seatbelt regulations had existed since the 1980s, but compliance in the rural provinces was patchy and the police had other things to do. Susan was an English country woman who had been driving without a seatbelt since she had first learned to drive in the 1950s, before seatbelts had been a standard feature of British cars at all. She drove without one in Argentina in the same spirit, which was the spirit of a woman who had been doing it for 40 years and had not yet died of it. A small biographical note, because it explains something about the temperament. Susan, by the testimony of those who knew her in the 90s, had become in widowhood something close to fearless. The friends and colleagues who appear in the obituary tributes describe a woman who drove fast, rode fast, drank steadily without ever quite getting drunk, smoked when she felt like it, said what she thought, and showed almost no anxiety about the kinds of things that anxious people her age and her income tend to be anxious about. This was not a death wish. The friends are clear on the distinction. It was the orientation of a woman who had spent her first 35 years being careful about every small thing, and had decided in the second half of her life that being careful about every small thing was not a way to live, and that the ranch and Hector and Argentina had given her the license not to. The flipped car of 1997 did not put a dent in this. If anything, walking away from it confirmed her in it. September of 1998 was the early Argentine spring. Susan, who was now 61, had spent that Saturday afternoon at lunch with friends in the city of Trenklawiken, which was the nearest town of any size to her remaining piece of El Pucará. Her 25-year-old nephew Rafael Barrantes, Hector's nephew on his side, not hers, was visiting and was in the passenger seat. They left the lunch in the late afternoon. The drive back to the ranch was about 80 kilometers, on the kind of two-lane road described above. The light was failing. The wind, by the description of the police report, was unusually strong. The traffic on the road, again by the police report, was unusually heavy for a Saturday evening. Around 9 in the evening, on a flat stretch of road approximately 520 kilometers west of Buenos Aires, Susan's green Rover crossed into the oncoming lane and struck a Renault catering truck head-on. The driver of the truck was a man called Jose Maria Rodriguez. He was a friend of hers. He was 57. He suffered a broken ankle. Rafael, in the passenger seat, suffered minor injuries and was hospitalized overnight. Susan, in the driver's seat, was killed instantly. The contemporary news reports describe the cause of death in clinical terms which I will not quote again. She was not wearing a seatbelt. The reported speed varies in the various accounts between roughly 124 miles per hour and a more conservative figure that the police themselves used, which was simply that the speed was inappropriate for the road. The most likely chain of events, by the Argentine police's own description in the days that followed, was either a moment of distraction or the headlights of an oncoming vehicle blinding her, causing her to drift across the center line. The truck driver, Rodriguez, did not have time to swerve. The news traveled in the way news of that kind traveled in 1998, which is to say by phone. A farm worker at El Pucará rang the ranch staff, who rang the various people in the family they had numbers for. Sarah, who was on holiday at the home of an Italian count called Filippo della Gherardesca in Tuscany, with her younger daughter Eugenie and a nanny, was woken at 4 in the morning. She had been at a party at the count's home the previous evening. A guest at that party would later describe her as having been laughing and joking, in the kind of slightly self-conscious way a recently divorced duchess laughs and jokes when she has been invited to a continental party at which she would prefer to be enjoying herself. The phone call came in the early hours. By 6, she had told the count's house. By 8, she was on the road to a Tuscan airport. By the evening, she had landed in London and reorganized her travel for Buenos Aires. She made several calls during the day. She rang Jane in Sydney first. She rang her father in Hampshire. She rang her uncle Brian Wright. She rang Andrew, her former husband, at Balmoral. The phone calls, by the testimony of the people who took them, were short and contained. The Queen, who was in Kuala Lumpur on a state visit to Malaysia and Brunei, was told the news on the runway and broke from the official schedule to say prayers for Susan. The Buckingham Palace press release, in the standard form of words, said the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were shocked and saddened. Major Ron in Hampshire told reporters it was an absolute tragedy and that he was very upset, particularly for his daughters. The second Mrs. Ferguson said she had had great admiration for Susan, that Susan had been a vivacious and beautiful woman, and that she was so upset for Sarah and Jane. The press ran obituaries. The shorter ones said the bolter had died. The longer ones said the mother of the Duchess of York had died in a car crash in Argentina. The longest, in the Daily Telegraph the following Monday, ran to about 1,000 words and was the first attempt by anyone in the British press in 26 years to give the woman a full account. The funeral was 3 days later, at El Pucará. Susan was buried, as she had asked to be, in the vault beneath the house, beside Hector. The vault was now full. Sarah traveled to Argentina for the burial with her uncle. Jane flew in from Sydney. There was a memorial service in London some weeks later, at St. Paul's Church in Knightsbridge, which is the kind of London church where the polo and racing world goes to remember its own. Major Ron attended, so did a great many other figures from the polo world. The Duchess of York attended with her 2 daughters. Andrew Parker Bowles, the polo player who had once been married to Camilla, was photographed arriving. The Argentine government paid no particular notice. The British royal family sent representatives but did not attend in person, which was the correct level of attendance for the mother of a former daughter-in-law who had divorced into private life 2 years earlier. A note about the timing, which I have not seen anyone else quite make, but which is worth making. Susan died on the 19th of September 1998. Diana, Princess of Wales, the daughter of Susan's old school friend Francis Roche, had died on the 31st of August 1997 in another European car accident that involved a black saloon at high speed and a driver who was not at his best. Susan and Sarah had attended Diana's funeral together at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of September 1997. Susan died 54 weeks after Diana's funeral in the same month of the calendar in the kind of accident that the Diana inquest had spent the previous year examining in painful detail. Sarah, in the year between September of 1997 and September of 1998, lost first the closest woman friend of her adult life and then the only mother she had ever had. The 2 losses are not the same. The proximity of them in a single 13-month window is the kind of detail that history does not usually engineer and that, when it does, leaves the survivor with nothing useful to do with it. The vault by the polo field. There is a question that is worth asking at this point, because the title of this whole thing is asking it, and because the inspiration scripts asked similar questions of their subjects. The question is, did the royal family hate her? The honest answer is that they did not. Hating, in the operating manual of the British royal family, is a level of emotional commitment they reserve for figures who have actively tried to harm the institution, and Susan never did. What they did with her was something more subtle and more characteristic, which is that they kept her at the precise distance her circumstances required and not an inch closer. From 1972 to 1986, that distance was complete. She was not on the lists, not at the parties, not in the Christmas cards. From 1986 to her death in 1998, the distance shortened to whatever was needed for the daughter and the granddaughters, and not a millimeter more. The Queen never hosted Susan at Sandringham. Susan never spent a weekend at Balmoral. The relationship, to the extent it existed, was the polite, formal relationship of an in-law's mother who had a complicated history that the family in question did not propose to inquire into. The exception, throughout, was Charles. He was the closest. He had liked her in the 60s when she was a polo wife. He liked her in the 90s when she was an Argentine widow. He wrote her forward. He sent his condolences when Hector died. He showed up to the right things at the right times. The Charles-Susan friendship is one of those small, unexamined corners of his biography that tells you something useful about him, which is that he is not, in his choice of friends, particularly governed by the family's strategic calculations. He liked her. He told the rest of them when it came up that he liked her. The rest of them, on their long internal calculus, accepted that this was what Charles was going to do and decided to leave it alone. The other exception was Philip, in the way Philip was always an exception. Whatever the truth of the alleged 60s affair, and I want to be clear one more time, that the only direct claim we have is from Andrew Loney writing in 2025, with both parties dead, the public friendship between Susan and Philip was a fact of 40 years standing. They liked each other. They danced at the same events, played in the same polo circle, were photographed at the same tournaments. Philip, who was famously short with strangers and famously warm with the small circle he allowed himself, included Susan in the small circle. He continued to do so intermittently after 1972, in the way that the old guard of the royal social world continued to do small kindnesses for the bolters of their generation, on the principle that everyone had made a mess of something somewhere and that one did not abandon one's friends to the press over it. When Susan died, Philip was the one in the press release. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were shocked and saddened. The Duke of Edinburgh is in the sentence by name. The order matters, it always did. The wider royal household, the people whose job it was to maintain the institutional view, were less warm. Susan's interviews in the 90s had not pleased them. Her gente remarks about Sarah being prepared to talk had alarmed them. The general fact of her being a divorced, bolted Argentine domiciled mother of a now divorced duchess was not the kind of fact the household preferred to have in its operating environment. They were polite to her on the few occasions they had to be. They did not invite her where they did not have to. After 1998, they were briefly relieved. The number of places in any institution from which a mother of an outgoing duchess can cause trouble is small but non-zero, and Susan's death closed off most of them, none of which they would ever have said. The Queen Mother, who had been a constant, slightly distant fixture in this whole story since Susan's debut at court in 1954, had her own view, which was the most interesting view in the family because the Queen Mother had spent her life paying close attention to the people her granddaughter's generation had married, and had a long memory for who had behaved well and who had not. Her view of Susan, by the testimony of the courtiers who survived her, was complicated. She did not approve of the bolting. She had no particular sympathy for Argentine polo players. She had liked Ron in the way she had liked all the men of his vintage who had ridden with Philip. But she had, in the way of women of her own generation who had themselves nearly ended up in different lives, a private sense that one did not too easily judge the women who had made the choices Susan had made. She kept her distance from Susan after 1972. She did not cut her. She sent a small private message of condolence in 1998 that has not been published. The Queen Mother, who would die 4 years later, in 2002, was the last figure from the original Buckingham Palace generation to remember Susan as the bright, slightly anxious young woman who had been presented at court in the second year of her granddaughter's reign. What the daughters did at the end was complicated and humanly recognizable. Jane went home to Sydney, mourned her mother in the private way she had mourned everything, and did not give an interview. Sarah, who had given more interviews than any other person in this story by a considerable margin, gave several more, in which she said things about her mother that ranged from the harsh to the deeply tender depending on the year she was asked and the audience she was talking to. In 2015, she wrote the open letter to her dead mother in Lisa Erspamer's book that I have already quoted from, in which she wrote that not a day went by that she did not wish she could pick up the phone and that she had come to thank, forgive, and love her more, and that she was convinced she would never have been a strong person without having had to deal with the feeling of abandonment. The letter is a piece of grief work 17 years later. It is also, to my eye, the most accurate description of the relationship anyone has ever written, and it was written by the woman who was on the receiving end of it. What the title got wrong. The title of this script, Sarah Ferguson's Mother Was Vicious, Ruthless, and Hated by Royals, is a tabloid title in the long tradition of tabloid titles, which means it is half right and half a useful distortion, and worth picking apart now we have walked through the actual record. Was she vicious? Vicious is a word that does specific work. It means cruelty for its own sake, pleasure taken in damage. Susan was not vicious in this sense. She was a strict mother by the standards of any present-day reader, an ordinary mother by the standards of the mid-century English country class she came from, and an absent mother for most of her two daughters' adolescence. The hairbrush story is real. The semolina story is real. The walking out is real. None of these are the work of a woman taking pleasure in damage. They are the work of a woman who had not been given the tools for the job and who, when given the chance to leave the job, took it. Vicious is not the right word. Was she ruthless? Ruthless, like vicious, is a word that does specific work. It means a willingness to inflict harm on others in pursuit of one's own ends, accepted as a price worth paying. The 1972 walkout fits this definition more closely. Susan, by leaving, accepted that the price of her own happiness was going to be paid by her two small daughters, and she took it anyway. The ruthlessness was real. It was not on the available evidence accompanied by pleasure or by any later denial. She knew what she had done. She had decided that she would do it anyway. The decision held for the rest of her life. Was she hated by royals? No. The royal family is bad at hating. The royal family is good at distance, at strategic coolness, at the unreturned calling card and the never-issued invitation. Susan was on the receiving end of all of these for parts of her later life. Hated, no. The wrong layer of the institutional reaction has been picked up by the title and dignified with a stronger word than it ever earned. What is true, and what the inspiration scripts at the front of this brief did with their own subjects, is that the Mitford-style answer is closer to the right answer for Susan than the tabloid answer. She was a woman whose private life, when examined carefully, contained the same kinds of contradictions that the Mitford sisters' lives contained. Coldness toward her own children at one extreme, real warmth toward her chosen friends at the other. A public scandal in the 70s, a slow rapprochement with her daughters in the 90s, a continuing friendship with a future king of England that the press never quite knew what to do with. The picture is more interesting than the tabloid version, and considerably less flattering than the family-defended version, and the woman who actually existed sat somewhere between them. There is one further small thing to say about Sarah, because the closing of the story is in her hands more than in anybody else's. Sarah went on, after her mother's death, into a complicated late middle age. The marriage to Andrew was over. The duchessship continued in name. The various scandals continued. The John Bryan toe-sucking of 1992 that I have already mentioned, the financial difficulties throughout the late 90s and the 2000s, the increasingly visible dependence on Andrew's presence in her own life despite the divorce, the friendship with the American sex offender Jeffrey Epstein that produced its own catastrophe in the period from 2009 onwards. The Epstein connection ended in the disclosures of January 2026, with Sarah losing the courtesy use of the Duchess of York title altogether. By the time of the publication of the Epstein emails, in which Sarah had addressed Epstein as her dear, spectacular, and special friend Jeffrey, and thanked him for being the brother she had always wished for, Sarah had been motherless for 27 years. There is a useful question to ask about what Susan, had she lived, would have made of her daughter's late-period choices. The answer is that Susan would not have made them. Susan, for all her own faults, did not associate with men who hurt children. Susan, for all her own failures of judgment, had a horse trader's instinct for which men were dangerous and which were merely flawed, and she would have got Epstein's number on the first phone call. The mother who had bolted in 1972 would have been the mother who, in 2009, told her daughter to put the phone down. She did not get the chance to be that mother because she had been dead for 11 years by the time the choice arose. The absence of her in Sarah's life from 1998 onwards is one of the small private tragedies that does not show up in any institutional history of the House of York, and which turns out, in retrospect, to have mattered more than anyone in the institutional history would ever have predicted. I keep coming back to a small detail at the end. Susan, in her will, asked to be buried in the vault beneath the main house at El Pucará, next to Hector, beside the polo field on which both of them had spent the best years of their lives. Sarah honored the request. The vault is there now, in flat country, on land that Kerry Packer's heirs largely now own, on a piece of property that Sarah and Jane inherited the smaller portion of and which Sarah has visited only intermittently since. 25 years on, the polo field is still there. The horses are still there, run by people who took on the breeding program after Susan died. The house is still there, with the vault beneath it, with the two coffins in it, of a woman who left England in 1972 to be with the man in the second coffin, and of the man who got there first, by 8 years, by accident and by cancer, and who is buried beside her. The title of this script promised vicious, ruthless, hated by royals. The reality on the available record is more careful. Susan Barrantes was a woman raised by a mother who had not been raised to mother her, married at 18 to a man who would not stay home, kept in a marriage by social pressure rather than by feeling, and who, at 35, did the unforgivable thing for the right reason and never said sorry for it because she had not been wrong. She paid for that decision in the only currency the cost was charged in, which was the gap between herself and her two daughters. She made some of the gap up before she died. She did not make all of it up, because nobody, given those circumstances, ever does. The royal family did not hate her. The press did not in the end destroy her. Her younger daughter, who described her in the same year as the woman who had hit her with a hairbrush and the most brilliant person she had ever met, was telling the truth on both counts, the road and what stayed. There is an Argentine phrase that gets used by older country people in the Pampas, and I came across it while reading the local press accounts of Susan's funeral, that captures something about the kind of life she had constructed in the second half of her existence. The phrase is entre dos cielos, between two skies, and it is what country people in the Pampas sometimes say about a person who has lived in two countries and belonged fully to neither. Susan was, for the second half of her life, between two skies. She was English in Argentina. She was Argentine in England. She was the bolter when the British press wrote about her. She was the Señora Inglesa, the English lady, when the Argentine press wrote about her. She was the mother of the Duchess of York in one set of newspapers and a horse breeder of some local repute in another. Neither description was wrong, neither was sufficient. The road on which she died was, in its own way, the kind of place you might construct as a metaphor for a life like hers if you were trying to write fiction. Two-lane highways in flat pampas have a particular character. You can see for a great distance in either direction. There are no surprises in the landscape. The danger comes entirely from the small mistakes of the drivers, your own and the drivers coming the other way, multiplied by speed. A two-lane Pampas highway is, structurally, an environment designed to punish overconfidence. Susan had been overconfident on roads of this kind for 25 years. The road was patient. It punished her in the end. I want to close this with a small, honest assessment of what the inspiration scripts at the front of this brief did, and what I have tried to do here, because the structure of all four of these stories, the Cushings, the Mitfords, the Astors, and the Ferguson Barrantes, is the same structure, and it is worth saying out loud what the structure is. Each of these stories is about women who built lives at the very edge of an English-speaking class system that had certain rigid rules, who built those lives by either exemplifying the rules or breaking them, and whose stories, when followed to the end, demonstrate that the rules they had bet on or against had a much shorter remaining lifespan than any of them realized at the time. The Cushing sisters bet on the rules and won the bet only to discover that the rules had been replaced before they could collect on the winnings. The Mitford sisters bet against the rules in a half-dozen different directions and produced 6 lives that, taken collectively, told the story of the 20th century in a way nobody else's family did. Caroline Astor enforced the rules harder than anyone else had ever enforced them, and outlived the period in which the rules could be enforced at all. Susan Barrantes is in the same set. She was raised inside the rules. She broke them once, decisively, in the summer of 1972. She paid for the breaking for the next quarter century. The rules she had broken were already, at the time she broke them, in the late stages of dissolving. The English country social order that produced women like Susan and constrained them in marriages like the Ferguson marriage was, by the early 70s, in the same trajectory as the Cushing world had been in the 1950s and the Astor world had been in the 1900s. There would be no more debutantes at court after 1958. There would be no more Polo wives expected to spend their 30s standing on the sidelines after about 1985. Susan had been one of the last women raised under the old code, and her bolt to Argentina was, in retrospect, one of the early signals that the old code was no longer enforceable. She did not know this at the time. She thought she was simply leaving Ron. She was. She was also, in a small way, performing one of the early funerals for a way of life that would in any case not survive her by very long. If you were to drive today on the road where she died, you would see almost nothing. The road is still there, the Pampas is still there, the catering truck and the green Rover are gone. There is no marker. Argentine country highways do not, as a general rule, mark the places where individual people have died on them, because if they did, the road would be lined with markers and nobody would be able to think about anything else. The place is approximately 520 kilometers west of Buenos Aires. It is unremarkable. The wind blows across it. Trucks pass on it. 80 kilometers further west is what remains of El Pucará. The house is still there, smaller than it was in Hector's time, but recognizably the same building. The polo field is there. The vault is beneath the main floor. There is a plaque. The current owners, the family who took on the breeding program from Susan's estate, or what is left of it after the Packer transactions and the smaller subsequent sales, are courteous to occasional visitors but do not advertise the connection. A small Argentine polo trophy is named after Hector, the Copa Hector Barrantes, and is contested every year by the players he trained or who trained on his ponies, and there is a smaller informal tradition among the Anglo-Argentine polo wives of his widow's generation of including her in the toasts, when toasts are made, on the anniversary of her death. I do not know what eventually happened to her dogs. There must have been dogs at the flat in Recoleta and at the country house. Susan kept dogs the way English country women keep dogs, which is to say steadily and in numbers and across decades. The dogs are not in any of the press accounts. Some kind family member or staff member would have absorbed them after the funeral. Somebody is still alive in Argentina today who held one of those dogs at the wake. Somebody is alive in England today who has a letter Susan wrote in the 80s in the ranch paper she favored, with the El Pucará letterhead at the top. Most of those letters are in private collections that will not be released. Sarah, in the years since 1998, has remained the public surface of all of this. She has lived in Verbier, she has lived at Royal Lodge, she has been evicted from Royal Lodge, she has lost the duchesship, she has written a great many books, given a great many interviews, raised 2 daughters who have themselves now had children, navigated the continuing slow-motion catastrophe of her former husband's reputation, and survived in the end on the same combination of resilience and indignity that her mother survived on, which is the combination of a particular slice of English country womanhood that has not yet been entirely stamped out and that may, given everything, outlast any of us. Sarah is 66 years old as of this writing. Her mother died at 61. The 5 years Sarah has had that her mother did not are years in which Sarah has continued, on the available record, to call her mother the most brilliant person she has ever known. The hairbrush in this scoring is forgiven. The leaving in this scoring is not entirely forgiven but is understood. The understanding will have to do. There is one final image I keep coming back to, and I want to finish with it because it is in the photographs and the photographers who took it did not know what they were taking. It is from the wedding day in July of 1986. The picture is in the throne room at Buckingham Palace in the hour before the procession went out. Susan is straightening Sarah's veil. Sarah is laughing, Susan is not. The 2 women are about 3 feet apart. The mother is leaning slightly forward. The daughter is looking somewhere else, not at the camera, not at the mother, at some point off frame where the photographer was not standing. Susan's hands are on the veil. They are concentrating on the fabric. They are not concentrating on the daughter. The daughter is laughing. There is a moment of quiet between them in the middle of the noisiest day of either of their lives. They will see each other only intermittently for the next 12 years. They will both think, separately and probably without saying so, that the next 12 years will produce more occasions like this one and that they will get to know each other again in the way mothers and daughters get to know each other again after a long absence, which is slowly, with mistakes, with small forgivenesses given and taken in unequal amounts, with the eventual understanding that the losses of the earlier years are not going to be entirely repaid, but that the trying matters anyway. They will not get the chance to do this. The mother has 12 years left from the moment the picture is taken. 8 of them will be Hector's last. 2 of them will be the slow public dismemberment of the daughter's marriage. The remaining 2 will go very quickly. Then there will be a windy night on a 2-lane road 520 kilometers west of Buenos Aires, and the picture in the throne room at Buckingham Palace will be one of the last in which both of them are alive at the same time and looking in their different directions at something the photographer did not see. The horses are still there. The road is still there. The vault is still there. The wind is what does not stop. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.